They said his own brother wanted him gone. They said the house wasn't even his anymore. But no one knew what his father buried beneath it. He smiled for her. He always smiled for her. But behind that smile, his entire world was collapsing, one signature at a time. Overnight, he became the villain in his own hometown. But they had no idea the ground beneath his house was about to rewrite the entire story. 9 feet beneath his kitchen floor, his father had been waiting 30 years to finally have the last word. They tried to force him out. His father made sure they never could. This is the story of a house that refused to fall.
Daniel Whitmore never imagined that the sound of a single knock on his front door could end up changing the course of his entire life. It was a gray Tuesday morning in October, the kind of morning where the sky looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain or not, and Daniel was in the kitchen pouring cereal for his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, when 3 men in dark suits walked up his porch steps carrying a folder thick enough to hold a man's whole existence. If you have ever felt like the people who were supposed to protect you were the very ones trying to take everything away, then you already know exactly how Daniel felt in that moment. And if this story moves you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this deserve to be heard, and there is so much more waiting for you till the very end. Daniel was 38 years old, a carpenter by trade, broad-shouldered from years of manual labor, with tired brown eyes that still carried warmth whenever his daughter laughed. 3 years earlier, his wife Sarah had died in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway, leaving him to raise Emma alone in the same house he had grown up in, a modest 2-story home with faded blue shutters that his own father, Walter Whitmore, had built with his bare hands back in the early 1980s. It wasn't a grand house. It didn't have marble floors or a swimming pool, but it had history in every creaking floorboard, love baked into every wall, and it was the only inheritance Daniel had left of the father he lost when he was just 19. The men on the porch that morning were not selling anything. They were delivering an ultimatum. The tallest of them, a slick-suited lawyer named Gregory Voss, introduced himself as representing a company called Ashcombe Development Group, and beside him stood a face Daniel hadn't seen in over a decade, his estranged half-brother, Marcus. Marcus had been born from their father's brief second marriage after their parents divorced, and the 2 brothers had barely spoken since their father's funeral, where an old argument about the will had driven a permanent wedge between them. Marcus smiled that same crooked, calculating smile he always had as a teenager, the one that meant trouble was coming. "Daniel," Marcus said, holding up a folder of his own, "we need to talk about the house." What followed was a conversation that felt like the floor had been ripped out from under Daniel's feet. Marcus claimed that their father had left behind a supplementary clause in an old, previously unfiled will, one that granted Marcus partial ownership of the property, on the condition that if either sibling wanted to sell, the other could be legally compelled to comply if the majority of the value was to be split evenly. Gregory Voss, representing Ashcombe, explained that the company had already begun purchasing surrounding lots for a large commercial redevelopment project, and Daniel's house sat squarely in the middle of their planned site. They wanted to buy it, and if Daniel refused, Marcus's claim, they said, gave them legal grounds to force a sale through the courts. Daniel's hands were shaking as he studied the documents. Something about it didn't sit right in his gut, though he couldn't yet explain why. He had never once, in 19 years, heard his father mention any second will. Walter Whitmore had been a meticulous man, and every document Daniel had ever seen from him had one single, unmistakable signature, a signature Daniel had memorized since childhood from birthday cards and old letters. The signature on this new document looked close, painfully close, but something about the slant of the W felt wrong. Still, Daniel didn't have the money for a lengthy legal battle. Single fatherhood had drained his savings faster than he expected. Medical bills from Sarah's accident, funeral costs, Emma's school expenses, and the slow bleeding of a carpentry business that barely broke even in a town where big box stores had killed half the small contractors. Marcus and Ashcombe Development knew this. They came prepared, offering just enough money to make refusal look irrational to anyone watching from the outside, while quietly threatening a costly court fight that could take years and leave Daniel bankrupt even if he eventually won. For weeks, Daniel fought back the only way he knew how, with stubbornness and love for his daughter as fuel. He visited 3 different lawyers, but each one, after reviewing the paperwork, gave him the same discouraging answer. The case wasn't impossible to win, but it would take money he didn't have and time he couldn't afford, especially with a young daughter depending on him. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread through the small town of Millhaven. Neighbors who once waved warmly at Daniel now looked away when he passed, as if the entire community had already decided he was some kind of obstacle standing between Millhaven and progress. Ashcombe's PR team had been busy painting the redevelopment as a bright new future for the town. New jobs, a shopping plaza, a community center. And Daniel, in their story, was cast as the stubborn holdout blocking prosperity for everyone else. Every morning before that knock on the door, Daniel's life had followed a quiet, comforting rhythm that he had built out of necessity after Sarah died. He woke at 5:30 to start a pot of coffee, packed Emma's lunch in the same purple lunchbox she refused to replace even though the zipper barely worked anymore, and drove her to school before heading to whatever job site needed a carpenter that week. Evenings were for homework at the kitchen table, dinner that was rarely fancy but always made with care, and bedtime stories that Daniel told from memory because Emma liked hearing them in his own words better than reading them off a page. It was a small life, an ordinary life, but it was theirs, stitched together out of grief and stubborn love, and it was the only kind of peace Daniel had left after losing Sarah so suddenly. He often caught himself talking to her photograph on the nightstand late at night, telling her about Emma's day, asking her silently what he was supposed to do now that the ground beneath their family felt like it was shifting again. The isolation hurt almost as much as the threat of losing the house. At Emma's school pickup line, another parent muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "Some people just don't know when to let go." At the local hardware store where Daniel had bought supplies for 15 years, the owner, a longtime family friend, suddenly seemed too busy to talk. Daniel began to understand that this fight wasn't just against his brother and a corporation. It was against an entire narrative being built around him, one designed to make him feel like giving up was the only reasonable choice left. Ashcombe Development Group didn't stop at whispers. They organized a town hall meeting at the Millhaven Community Center, presenting glossy renderings of a shining new plaza, complete with a fountain, a farmer's market pavilion, and promises of 200 new local jobs. Daniel sat near the back, arms crossed, watching as his neighbors nodded along, seduced by the promise of a brighter future for a town that had been quietly dying for years, its Main Street storefronts boarded up one by one. When a company spokesperson gently mentioned that one remaining property owner was delaying the timeline, dozens of heads turned to look at Daniel, and he felt for the first time in his life like a stranger in the only town he had ever called home. A woman he'd known since childhood, someone who used to babysit him when he was younger than Emma was now, leaned toward her husband and murmured just loud enough for Daniel to hear, "I heard he's just holding out for more money." The unfairness of it lodged in his throat like a stone he couldn't swallow. He left before the meeting ended, unable to sit through another minute but being cast as the villain in a story that was, in truth, being written entirely by the people trying to take his home. Then came the night that broke him. Emma had a school project due the next morning, a shoebox diorama of where I feel safest, and she chose to build a tiny replica of their house, complete with a popsicle stick porch and a cotton ball cloud sky. She proudly showed it to her father before bed, beaming as she pointed to the little paper figures she'd drawn of the two of them sitting on the porch swing. "This is us, Daddy. This is home." Daniel sat on the edge of her bed long after she fell asleep that night, staring at that little shoebox house, feeling the full weight of what he stood to lose. It wasn't wood and nails he was protecting. It was every memory Emma had left of stability, safety, and belonging. That same week, Gregory Voss returned with a final offer, dressed up in polite language but unmistakably a threat. If Daniel refused to sign the sale agreement voluntarily, Ashcombe would pursue the partition lawsuit through Marcus's claim, freeze Daniel's assets during litigation, and make sure the process dragged on so long that Daniel would lose the house anyway. Except this time, with none of the settlement money and a mountain of legal debt on top. Beaten down, terrified of losing everything and leaving Emma with nothing, Daniel finally signed the preliminary agreement. his hand trembling as he wrote his name beneath a stack of legal jargon he barely had the strength to read anymore. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find a way to fight back later, that some fights simply couldn't be won by a single exhausted father working with his hands for a living against men who fought with paperwork and money. The demolition crew was scheduled to begin site preparation within the month. Before the heavy machinery could roll in, however, Ashcombe's engineers required a full structural and foundation survey of the property, standard procedure before any commercial rebuild. It was during this survey, on an unusually warm afternoon in late November, that everything changed. A young surveyor named Priya Anand was running ground-penetrating radar scans beneath the house to map out utility lines and soil composition, when her equipment picked up something strange. A large, dense, rectangular anomaly buried roughly 9 feet beneath what used to be the home's old root cellar, sealed away behind a section of concrete that appeared far newer than the rest of the foundation. Curious, and required to document any anomalies for the demolition safety report. Priya flagged it to her supervisor, who in turn informed Ashcombe's site manager. Word eventually reached Daniel, who was allowed back onto the property one final time to remove personal belongings before the survey crew broke through the sealed section themselves. Daniel arrived that morning with a strange, tight feeling in his chest, a feeling he hadn't been able to shake since Priya's supervisor mentioned the words sealed compartment over the phone. He remembered, suddenly and vividly, a moment from his childhood, being 9 years old, sneaking down into the root cellar past his bedtime and finding his father down there in the dim lantern light, sweating, mixing concrete alone in the middle of the night, and being sharply told to go back upstairs and never speak of it again. Daniel had forgotten that memory for nearly 3 decades, buried under the ordinary noise of growing up. Now it came rushing back with a force that made his knees weak. He remembered his father's face that night more clearly than he had in years. The deep lines of exhaustion around Walter's eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he smoothed the wet concrete with a trowel, the strange mixture of fear and determination in his voice when he told young Daniel, "Some things a man has to protect even from the people he loves until the day comes when they need it." At the time, Daniel had assumed his father was simply hiding tools or hardware supplies, the ordinary secrets of a working man's basement. He never once imagined that his father had been quietly building a vault to safeguard the future of a son who wasn't even 10 years old yet, anticipating a battle that wouldn't arrive for another 3 decades. Walter Whitmore had never been an educated man in the formal sense. He'd left school at 16 to support his own mother. But he had a kind of patient, working-class wisdom that understood, long before Daniel ever could, that some enemies never truly disappear. They simply wait, and pass their grudges down like inheritance of a different, darker kind. When the crew broke through the false concrete wall his father had built decades earlier, they found a reinforced steel chamber, roughly the size of a small room, bone-dry and untouched by time. Inside were 3 things that would upend everything Daniel thought he knew about his family, his house, and the entire legal fight he had just lost. The first was a rusted metal strongbox containing bundles of old cash, silver coins, and a small velvet pouch of uncut gemstones, later appraised at a value that alone was worth more than triple what Ashcombe had offered him for the house. But it was the second item that mattered infinitely more, a sealed manila envelope containing the original, notarized last will and testament of Walter Whitmore, dated a full 6 years after the fraudulent supplementary will Marcus and Ashcombe's lawyers had used to build their entire legal case. This authentic will explicitly and unambiguously left the house solely to Daniel, with a handwritten note in the margin in his father's unmistakable handwriting, "For Daniel, who never once asked me for anything, and who deserves a home no one can ever take from him." The third item was the one that turned Daniel's grief into something closer to righteous fury, a thick folder of financial records, letters, and photographs documenting a long-buried dispute between Walter Whitmore and a young, ambitious real estate speculator decades earlier, a man named Harold Ashcombe, founder of the very same Ashcombe Development Group now trying to force Daniel out of his home. It turned out that Harold Ashcombe had once tried the exact same scheme against Walter back in the 1980s, using a forged partition claim through a corrupt cousin to try to seize the land the house now stood on. Walter fought it off in court, exposed the forgery with the help of a forensic handwriting expert, and won. But not before Harold Ashcombe swore, in a signed letter Walter kept as insurance, that he would return one day to finish what he started. Walter, fearing his enemies might destroy the evidence if they ever broke into the house, sealed everything away underground rather than risk it being lost or stolen, trusting that if it was ever needed again, fate would bring it back to light at the right time. The chamber smelled of damp earth and old rust, a smell that somehow reminded Daniel of his father's workshop, sawdust and machine oil mixed with the particular mustiness of a space that time had forgotten. Priya and the site manager had stepped back respectfully once they realized what they'd uncovered, giving Daniel a moment alone in the very space his father had sealed away nearly 30 years earlier. He knelt on the cold concrete, running his fingers along the edge of the steel chamber wall, half expecting it to disappear like a dream the moment he touched it. The lantern light Priya had rigged up cast long shadows across the room, and for a strange, suspended moment, Daniel could almost picture his father down here decades ago, alone in the dark, carefully wrapping each document in oilcloth before sealing them away, trusting a future he would never live to see. Daniel sat on the cold concrete floor of that hidden chamber for nearly an hour, gemstones forgotten beside him, reading his father's handwriting over and over, feeling as though Walter Whitmore had somehow reached across death itself to protect his son one final time. He read the margin note perhaps a dozen times, tracing his fingertip beneath each word as though he could absorb his father's voice through the ink itself. And when he finally allowed himself to cry, it wasn't out of relief or vindication, but out of a grief he had never fully let himself feel. The grief of realizing just how much his father had quietly loved him, in ways Daniel had spent 19 years without ever fully knowing. What followed was not simple triumph, but a hard-fought unraveling of the lie that had cornered Daniel for months. Armed with the authentic will and the decades-old evidence of Harold Ashcombe's original forgery scheme, evidence that closely mirrored the forged document Marcus had presented, Daniel hired a forensic document examiner using part of the recovered cash. The examiner confirmed within days that the supplementary will Marcus had produced bore telltale signs of digital tracing and inconsistent ink aging, conclusively proving it was fabricated, almost certainly with help from someone inside Ashcombe Development who had access to old Whitmore family documents to copy the signature from. When confronted, Marcus's resolve crumbled almost instantly. Years of financial desperation, a failed business, and mounting debt had made him an easy target for Gregory Voss and the elder Ashcombe family, who promised Marcus a hefty cut of the property sale in exchange for producing a convincing forged claim, betting correctly that the bitterness between the two half-brothers would make Marcus willing to participate. Marcus broke down in Daniel's driveway the day the truth came out, apologizing through tears, admitting that guilt had been eating at him for weeks, but greed and old resentment over their father's affection had kept him from turning back sooner. "You have to understand," Marcus said, his voice cracking as he leaned against his car, unable to look Daniel in the eye. "Growing up, it always felt like Dad's whole heart belonged to you in this house, and there was never anything left over for me. When Voss came to me with the paperwork, he didn't even have to convince me that it was fair. I already believed it was owed to me. I told myself I wasn't stealing anything, just finally taking my share." Daniel listened without interrupting, feeling old anger rise in his chest and then, slowly, deflate into something closer to sorrow. He remembered his own resentment toward Marcus over the years, the quiet belief that his half-brother had always been the outsider trying to wedge his way into a family that wasn't fully his, and he wondered, for the first time, whether that same belief, passed silently between the two of them for years without ever being spoken aloud, was part of what had made Marcus such easy prey for men like Voss and Ashcombe. Daniel, exhausted but no longer consumed by fear, told his brother something that surprised even himself, that he forgave him, not because what Marcus did was forgivable, but because Daniel refused to let anger poison the only family Emma had left besides him. Ashcombe Development Group was not so easily let off the hook. Daniel's lawyer, now working with real leverage instead of desperation, filed a countersuit exposing the fraudulent will, the forged inheritance claim, and decades of documented pattern behavior from Harold Ashcombe's original 1980s scheme, which the same company's current leadership had clearly known about and deliberately repeated. Local news picked up the story fast. Single father uncovers buried evidence that exposes real estate fraud decades in the making. Ran across every regional outlet within days, and public opinion in Millhaven flipped overnight. Reporters camped outside the house for nearly a week, and Daniel, uncomfortable as he was with the sudden attention, agreed to one interview only because he wanted the town to understand exactly how close they had come to celebrating the same kind of fraud that had once targeted his father. He spoke plainly without dramatics about the sealed chamber, the forged will, and the decades-old grudge that had finally come back around, and something about his quiet, unpolished honesty resonated far beyond Millhaven, with the story eventually picked up by outlets 2 states away. The same neighbors who once avoided Daniel's eyes now stopped him in the grocery store to shake his hand and apologize for ever doubting him. The woman who had once whispered about him holding out for more money showed up on his porch one Sunday afternoon with a homemade pie, stammering out an apology that Daniel accepted graciously, though he couldn't help noticing how quickly public opinion could swing once the facts finally came to light. It was a lesson he tucked away quietly, that the crowd's judgment, however loud and confident it sounded in the moment, was rarely the same thing as the truth. The legal settlement that followed was decisive. Ashcombe Development Group was forced to pay Daniel a substantial settlement for pain, damages, and attempted fraudulent seizure of his property, on top of dropping all claims to the land entirely. Gregory Voss lost his license to practice law within the state after the forgery scheme was traced back to falsified notarization records his own office had processed. The redevelopment project collapsed entirely, and the land surrounding Daniel's home was eventually rezoned as protected residential property, ensuring no future developer could attempt what Ashcombe had tried twice now across 2 generations. Daniel used part of the settlement and the recovered gemstones to restore the old house rather than sell it, keeping every original beam his father had built, adding only what was needed to make it safer and warmer for Emma to grow up in. He converted the old root cellar, once a place of secrecy and fear, into a small sunlit reading nook, placing a single-framed photograph of his father on the wall beside a preserved copy of that handwritten will. Every evening when he tucked Emma into bed, he told her a little more of the story, not the frightening parts about lawyers and threats, but the parts about a grandfather she never got to meet, who loved his son so much that he protected him even after death, patiently waiting decades underground for the truth to surface exactly when it was needed most. A few weeks after the settlement was finalized, Emma's teacher asked the class to present an update on their Where I Feel Safest projects, and Emma stood in front of her classmates with her little shoebox house, telling them, in the simple, matter-of-fact way that only a 7-year-old can manage, that her house had almost been taken away by bad men in suits, but that her grandfather, whom she'd never even met, had buried treasure under the floor to save it, like something out of a storybook. The other children gasped and asked a dozen questions at once, and Emma beamed with the particular pride of a child who suddenly realizes her own life contains a story worth telling. When Daniel picked her up that afternoon, and she recounted the whole scene to him, word for word, he laughed for the first time in months, a real laugh, unburdened. And he thought that if his father could see this moment, watching his granddaughter turn near catastrophe into a proud school presentation, he would have laughed too. As for Marcus, the reconciliation was slow but real. He began repaying little by little the guilt he carried, showing up some weekends to help Daniel with small repairs around the house, awkward at first, then gradually more natural. The way brothers who lost years to bitterness sometimes find their way back when given an honest second chance. Emma, who never fully understood the legal storm that had almost swallowed her childhood home, only knew that her Uncle Marcus started coming around more, that her father seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had finally lifted off his shoulders, and that the little shoebox house she built for her school project sat proudly on a shelf in her actual bedroom, a reminder of the home she almost lost and never had to lose after all. Spring came slowly to Millhaven that year, but when it finally arrived, it seemed to arrive all at once. The maple tree in front of the Whitmore house budded green again. The porch swing Walter had built decades earlier got a fresh coat of paint, and Emma's laughter echoed through a yard that no longer felt like it was standing on borrowed time. Daniel found himself sitting on that porch most evenings after work, the way his father once had, watching the streets settle into dusk, feeling something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time: safety. Not the fragile, temporary kind that could be taken away by a knock at the door, but the deep, settled kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and why. He kept his father's old strongbox, empty now of its cash and gemstones, but full still of meaning, on a shelf in the reading nook, right beside the framed will. Sometimes, when Emma had questions about her grandfather, Daniel would take it down and let her hold it, watching her small fingers trace the dents and rust along its edges, imagining in her own 7-year-old way a grandfather who had loved his father enough to bury treasure just to make sure the story ended right. She didn't need to understand the legal battles or the forged documents to understand the feeling underneath it all, that somebody, long before she was even born, had loved her family enough to fight for it from beyond the grave. Looking back, Daniel would often say that the hardest lesson of that entire ordeal wasn't about lawyers, forged documents, or greedy developers. It was learning that the people who try hardest to convince you to give up are usually the ones who are most afraid of what you'll find if you hold on just a little longer. His father had known that instinctively, decades before Daniel ever needed to learn it himself, and had left him not just gold and cash buried beneath their home, but proof, physical, undeniable proof, that some inheritances are not about money at all, but about the quiet, patient love of a parent determined to protect their child long after they are gone. If this story touched something in you today, remember that home isn't just 4 walls and a roof. It's the people who refuse to let you fight alone, even when they're no longer here to fight beside you. Sometimes the people who love us most leave behind more than we ever realize, not just houses or money, but quiet, patient proof that we were never as alone in our struggles as we believed. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories just like this one. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and I'll see you in the very next video.